Welcome back to Skills Upgrade, a Talking Drupal mini-series following the journey of a Drupal 7 developer learning Drupal 10. This is episode 3. I'm Amy June Heinlein. I am a Drupal mentor coordinator, and I work at the Linux Foundation as their certification community architect. Now, during this series, we'll follow a Drupal 7 developer as he upgrades his skills to work on Drupal 10 projects with that ultimate goal of supporting Drupal 10 project and contributing back to the community. This will be a weekly show. Each week, a mentor will review the developer's progress, answer questions, and set goals for the upcoming week. Now, let's meet our mentor and developer. Our developer is Chad Hester. He's Chad Hester on D.O. He's an enterprise technical consultant and solutions architect with a background in website development of over 20 years. And our mentor is Mike Anello, Ultimike, on Drupal.org. He's the co-founder and vice president of Drupal Easy, a Drupal training and consulting firm based in Central Florida. So today, Chad and Mike will discuss last week's homework, including getting a Drupal 10 site up and running, configuring PHP-CS and PHP-Stan. And regarding DDev, I really wonder what Chad decided to replace Docker Desktop with to make it more performant. I switched to Kalima last year to better align with my values, as Docker Desktop is not open source, and open source is a big value of mine. And I know that Mike has moved to SUSE's Rancher Desktop recently. And I'm curious if Chad had a smooth experience, because we know that conflicts sometimes occur when we do that kind of switch. So let's see how everything went.
Well, how have you been this past week, Michael?
I've been pretty good, Chad. How have you been? Well, welcome back.
Pretty good. Yeah. Happy Valentine's Day too. I think we're jumping backwards in time, I guess, for the folks listening to this. But yeah.
But we're not saying which year we recorded this in, so I think we're safe.
Several years ago. Yeah, my first love, my Valentine's, my wife, of course, but Drupal and the open source community has to be a close second.
Well, we got a lot to cover today, so we should just dive right in.
Let's do it.
I saw you have some questions, and I think all those questions are related to last week's tasks. So I'm going to run through what the tasks were, and I think as we go, we'll just weave the questions in. How about that?
Yeah,
I think that's all right. I think you have a question about the DDev performance improvements. I think I recommended that you switch away from Docker for Mac to something else. So how did that go?
Went pretty good. In general, I installed Rancher Desktop. That was easy enough. Turned off Docker Desktop, of course, before doing that. There were a couple of conflicts between the two with some of the symlinks for Docker. So it was trying to hold on to the Docker Desktop version. So thankfully, I know how symlinks work. I took a look at the error code and was able to just simply I renamed the old symlink. So if I want to flip it back, I can certainly do that if I needed to. But
that's
after
interesting.
I
didn't have to do that. I flip back and forth between Rancher Desktop and Docker for Mac often because in my teaching, I teach with both DDev and Lando. And I've never had to do anything with symlinks, so I'm curious as to why that was. Maybe I don't. My version of Docker for Mac isn't super up to date, so maybe that has something to do with it.
Yeah, I'm convinced that go ahead.
No, you go. Please go.
No worries. I'm convinced that when there are installers, because I used to write installers back in the days of Windows, that there are certain setup steps that occur. And sometimes, the developers will change the setup steps, but, a newer version may do something a little bit differently. That's my theory, at least.
Did you run Docker context use Rancher Desktop when you switched?
No, I didn't do that.
Well, maybe that's it. Okay, so there's a Docker command. Where you can set the context, and the context in this case seems like a weird word to use, but Docker needs to know if it's using Rancher Desktop, Docker for Mac, or OrbStack, or Kalima, or whatever. So when I switch between Docker for Mac and Rancher Desktop, I also have to issue the command Docker context use, and then either Rancher Desktop or Colima or default, which gets me back to Docker for Mac. So maybe that's doing the same thing as your symlink stuff.
That sounds like that's probably the case.
I'm pretty sure this is in the DDEV documentation, so you maybe just missed it. So
okay,
might move some things out for you.
There's so much documentation, like we talked about last week, so it's very easy to overlook those sort of things. My main focus was, can I get it up and running? Does it have any errors? And once I cleared those symlink issues, it didn't have any errors in the diagnostics, generally speaking.
All right, should we move on to the next task?
Yeah. Well, I guess there was one other kind of hang up with Rancher Desktop that I did notice. Similar to installing Docker Desktop, it still had some port issues. And in this case, what I had done before, which was reinstalling VMnetD, I'm guessing the virtual machine network daemon, that didn't work. That wasn't so much the issue. And I found out that it's Rancher Desktop holding on to port 443. And so I just switched the port. I didn't want to fuss with it anymore, but that was, a curiosity.
I'm wondering if this is the same thing.
Might be.
So let's put a pin in that, because and I'll be interested to hear about your experience using the Docker context use command.
Yeah, I'll take a look at that offline, and if it's still an issue, I'm sure we can find resources to figure that out.
All right. Any issues getting a fresh copy of Drupal 10 or installing the core dev dependencies?
Once I got everything clear with the virtualization, the ports, just switching that, I was able to run through the series of commands to install Drupal 10, get it up and running. I loaded up the web interface. The username password for admin came up no problem. Of course, I can always use a different username, which is good security practice, I know. And then I got through the core dev dependencies, a few other things like Coder and Devel, just kind of going through those things, getting those up and running.
So you shouldn't have to install Coder.
Okay.
If you install Drupal core dev, it's the same thing. Drupal core dev includes Coder. So you're installing it twice, basically. So
gotcha.
Keep that in mind. I used to have some of our students install Drupal Coder globally. And that way, if they didn't want to install or, for some reason weren't going to install core dev, they could still kind of access the tools. But over the past year or so, I've kind of in my head decided, I don't like that. There's too many pitfalls with that. So we're not even going to get into that. The right way to do this, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of people's opinion, is to just install Drupal core dev and get Drupal Coder, in your code base.
Okay.
All right.
I think that makes sense then. And I liked that. I knew about this for the past few years, but I just want to highlight that Composer supports the dev specific require lines. That was really nice too.
Yep. I was just going to mention one other thing about that, and it just left my head, but that's okay. So let's move on to. We also talked, and I pointed you some resources for configuring and using PHPCS for Drupal coding standards. How did that
go? That went well. I ran my first test. You'd said try just running it on the Node module, and I did exactly that just to see, well, what does this output actually even look like?
Yeah.
It was really straightforward. I really like the tool. I kind of wish something like that was around back when I was doing D7 work.
Yeah. It's funny because if you run PHP, like the up-to-date version of PHPCS with the up-to-date rule set, you will find files currently in Drupal core that do not meet coding standards. And the one example I can think of is were use statements. They're supposed to be listed alphabetically now. But that was just added to the coding standard within the past.
That's literally the first error that I took a screenshot just so I can remember what these things look like. And that's literally the first error that it highlighted.
Right. So this was kind of like the chicken and the egg situation where the coding standard was changed, But I don't think it's, no one's going to go through and update every single file in Drupal core to meet this new coding standard. It's just kind of like here's a new coding standard. As these files get worked on, let's, rearrange the use statements so they're alphabetical or whatever. And there's a few things like that. But yeah, that's a cool thing to run into. The one thing about PHP-CS, it's more of an issue that I have with the recommended project template, is it's not always super obvious how to set up that phpunit.xml file. Sorry, phpcs.xml file. So I know I sent you the resource. I gave you, probably a link for the resource, but that's something that I know trips people up.
That resource was really straightforward. That and the settings.local. I mean, both of them were really straightforward, and I think this is an example of good time-saving documentation.
Finding the resources are difficult. And I've got a great example that we're going to talk about in a little while, which I don't know if you were on the call when I was talking to Steve about it, but anyway, let's move on. PHP Stan, how about that?
Yeah, again, similar to PHP CS, I took just a snapshot of the node module just to see, well, how is it going to behave? What sort of output does it have?
With a different level.
Sort of thing. Like it really broke down the different things, and it even got to the point of like showing like what's been deprecated even in core things.
Yeah. No, I love PHP Stan. It's I don't know. It's one of those things I look back and I'm like, before I started using it regularly, it's like I almost felt I look back at those times, feel like, man, I probably missed so much. I probably made so many mistakes that were unnecessary, or things could have been just, that much better in a lot of different places, which adds up. So, all right. So settings.local we talked about. Sounds like you didn't have any issues with that.
And then the development was pretty straightforward. One part about the settings.local.php that came up that was a bit of a curiosity is in the documentation, somebody also mentioned a settings.ddev.php file.
Yeah, so I can talk about that real quick. So when you use ddev for a Drupal site, one of the things that ddev does is it generates a settings.ddev.php file, and it sticks it in sites default. And the whole point of it doing that is it kind of puts into that file the database connection information for ddev. So it makes it so when you install Drupal, you don't have to think about what do I need to enter for database connection information, because ddev already did it for you.
Okay.
I kind of extend that pattern. So when I teach, I've got a settings.lando.php file that I include. You just add it to the settings.php file as a conditional include, just like the settings.local. So I kind of do all of my stuff like that. I actually have some projects out there where I have to, for some reason, I forget why, but I actually have a settings.dev.php and a settings.live for different environments.
Okay.
So, I think you had a question about PHP Stan that we skipped, though.
Oh, yeah. So in terms of, I guess this is with any testing tool, because this is kind of the new ground for me.
Yeah.
Is how would I use either PHP CS or PHP Stan for doing community contrib? And if I'm jumping ahead and this is something that we'll cover later on, that's totally fine.
I feel like you're a plant for the Drupal Association, because the engineers at the DA are going to love this question. They're going to love that you asked it. The new GitLab CI that is available to Drupal cores using it, and contributor modules can opt into it, does make PHP CS and PHP Stan available, and a bit configurable as well. So as a module maintainer, you can opt in to have, every time there's a merge request made or a merge request merged, it will run that CI. It will run all the tests, but it'll also run a PHP CS run and report if there's any issues there. You can actually configure it to reject the merge request if there is an issue. So all that stuff is there and available. to contributors. Prior to GitLab CI, there was a bespoke Drupal CI that was all kind of custom code. That wasn't nearly as flexible as a GitLab CI. And I believe, I hope I don't get this date wrong, but the old Drupal CI is going to be turned off. I believe it's July 1st of 2024. So, GitLab CI is faster, better, more configurable, less bespoke code. I mean, it's win after win after win for this. So, and we can run PHP Stan and PHP CS and any other tool we throw at it as part of it.
Well, that sounds delightful, especially
it is delightful.
My first projects.
As a module maintainer, as a module maintainer, I like it very much. It's very good. As a module maintainer and someone who loves PHP Stan. Yeah. And then you had another question, which I'm going to let you ask about starting a D10 website from scratch.
Yeah. So, of course, getting in and setting up this environment, that's great if I'm starting to learn and get used to Drupal 10 and just experiment with things, or if I just want a sandbox to play in at any point in my career, that makes a lot of sense. But if I'm working with an agency or working with freelance clients, they most likely already have a Drupal site, whether it's 10 or otherwise. Mm-hmm. Would I take a similar sort of approach and then pull the code base, the database, and the files into a fresh environment and then just use that? Or is there a better technique to start with an existing site?
Yeah, an existing site, probably the best way to do it, assuming it's like a well-mannered existing site, right? It was made using somewhat best principles, let's say, best practices, I should say. You clone the code base down, bring it down to your sites directory, whatever. From the command line, navigate into the project root, do your ddev config, answer the questions, do your ddev start, import your database, and you're off and running, to be honest. You don't need to, the only time you're ever going to create a fresh Drupal 10 site is if you want a fresh Drupal 10 site. Okay. If you're working with an existing site that already exists, just take the clone, start from there. Otherwise, who knows? I mean, that seems like a bad idea to take an existing site and move it into another code base. I don't think you want any part of that, to be honest.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it would be a shortcut, like if it's setting up something about the environment that otherwise you would have to do manually. So
no, ddev is smart enough where you do that ddev config, it's going to sniff your site a little bit. It's going to, it'll create that settings.ddev like we talked about. It'll figure out it'll make a guess as to where your web root is. It'll make a guess as to if it's Drupal 9 or 10 or whatever, and you can confirm or deny all that stuff through that ddev config process. But it's pretty straightforward.
Okay. Well,
all right.
That actually feels a little bit more familiar then.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to next week. Tasks for next week. Because I feel like you're in pretty good shape with the stuff from last week. We'll touch base again on the Docker switching between Rancher Desktop and Docker for Mac next week as well. But some easy tasks, and then some. Now we're going to get to module development finally. So easy task number one, which we missed it. I probably should have included it last week, was install Drush using Composer. So you may have already done that.
The good thing is I already did that.
Okay. So, Composer required Drush/Drush. Didn't mention it, so make sure we have that in the checklist for anyone who's watching. Definitely want to do that. The next thing, I think it's always just good practice to do, even if it's a throwaway site, or for you, it's a learning site. So you probably want to do this, but you want to, track everything in Git.
Yep.
So we're not going to go over the absolute basics of Git. I mean, hopefully Git init, Git add, Git commit, all that good stuff. But where the interesting stuff is with Composer. And Composer manages dependencies. So how do we deal with those dependencies with Git? Like, what's the Drupal best practice? And the Drupal best practice really falls to what's the Composer best practice? And the Composer best practice is do not commit dependencies, right? So any dependencies that Composer manages, you don't need to put in the Git repository. you can tell Git to ignore them.
So git ignore file.
Yeah, so you have a git ignore file. As long as you're committing the composer.json and the composer.lock file, those two files can exactly reproduce all of your dependencies. So there's no need to put them in Git. Assuming, again, it's a well-behaved site and you're not hacking your dependencies.
Yeah.
Right?
And then that falls into the realm of things like patches and other things that you'll run with Composer.
We can talk about Composer patches. It's a Composer plugin another day. But yeah, you can. There is a best practice around patching dependencies using Composer in a way that keeps everything in your repository in the right way. So this was a little frustrating for me this morning because as I was going through like the tasks for next week and I want to make sure I give you good resources on where to find all this stuff, I could not find a straightforward resource on how to set up git ignore files for just a standard best practice based Drupal 10 site. And that kind of makes me crazy. I searched on Drupal.org for probably 20 minutes. I put it out on social media. I don't believe anyone's been able to point me to a single doc page that, and maybe I'm just too picky. I don't know. But for someone like you who's coming to Drupal 10, is using the Drupal recommended project composer template, as we should be, who just wants to set up, their repository so it's not including dependencies. I couldn't find like a straightforward resource. The information is there in bits and pieces in different places, but nothing was super straightforward.
Okay.
So I'm going to tell you how to do it. I should probably write another simple blog post on it, but I don't have time right now. And this is not one size fits all. There's a dozen different ways to do this.
Just a starting point, right?
Yeah, and this is the way that I do it, and I found success, and this is the way that I teach it in all my classes as well. Drupal core actually comes with an example.gitignore file.
Okay.
On the site, on your new D10 site that you have in the web directory, there's a file called example.gitignore. Step
there
one.
It is. Yep. I was looking for a regular one, but yeah, there it is.
Yeah. This one, it's in the web directory. It's not on the project root. It's in the web directory.
That's what tripped me out. I see Git attributes, but I didn't see that one.
Yep. So just go ahead and just copy that to web/.gitignore. And you can open that file and poke around and see what's in there. But that's kind of step one. But that doesn't get you everything. That doesn't even get you most of the stuff. That will ignore things like the files directory and your settings files and stuff like that. But we want to ignore like the entire vendor directory because that's all Composer dependencies. We want to ignore Drupal core directory because core is a Composer dependency. We want to ignore modules/contrib, themes/contrib, profile/contrib. All of those contrib modules are going to be coming through Composer. So we don't need to commit any of those to the repo.
Okay.
So to that end, step 2 is create a new .gitignore file on your project root. And I've got a little code snippet I'm going to give you, and we'll put it with the show notes for this. It's 7 lines of ignores.
Okay.
And I'm going to read it real quick, just so people who don't want to, look at the notes. /vendor, /web/core, web modules contrib, themes, web themes contrib, web profiles contrib, web libraries, and I always ignore star.sql.gz, which is usually database backups.
I do recall one set of things that I would oftentimes also put in my .git ignores was any of the IDE related files. Is that not a concern anymore? Or is that something to consider?
So it depends on the project, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Okay.
There are like PHP Storm. I almost always ignore that idea folder because it's huge and it has all kinds of crazy stuff. VS Code though is very judicious. Like the launch.json file that you get from using Xdebug, that can be used among multiple developers if we're all using VS Code. Even the workspace settings, you might. It really depends on the team. So, usually
advanced stuff at
they're
that.
ignored. But yeah, a lot of times you keep them in.
And then sometimes there was also operating system files like the .ds store from Mac and things like that.
You know what? I just had I taught this topic earlier today as well, and I just had this conversation with my students earlier today. I actually put that silly Mac.ds store in a global git ignore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I never see it because yeah. So
Makes
there
sense.
is such a thing. You can have a global git ignore for your entire machine.
So in your example, as well as in the example that's in the file that you want me to copy, they have trailing slashes in some, but not all. Does that matter?
Yeah, I know. I now that you mentioned, I'm looking at my little code snippet. I don't know if it matters.
Okay.
I don't have an answer for you.
I'm more pedantic with technical things, mostly because I know sometimes it does.
There's homework for you, Chad. Let me know if it matters.
No, that's good.
Right.
Yeah, that should be easy enough, and I'll take your advice also with the global .getignore. Setting up all of that stuff before I get into things professionally, I think is just good practice.
Yep, and I'm sure you'll run into projects as you clone, projects down. Just take a peek at how they're doing their .getignore stuff. I wish there was one, recommended way of doing it. There are definitely some issues on Drupal.org discussing it. That probably went on longer than they need to, in my opinion, but apparently there's been no consensus, so we don't have anything like that. All right, let's move on. Let's get to the good stuff. Finally, enough of this setup stuff. Let's learn let's start talking about some code here. So first thing, we're gonna really focus on using the examples module to learn.
Remember that one.
Yeah, the examples module is still awesome. Vlad the Bald is a gentleman from, I wish I could, I want to say Bulgaria. He might be from Bulgaria. Great guy. There's other maintainers of the examples modules, not just Vlad, so apologies to the other maintainers. But just a wonderfully maintained module that demonstrates how to code different things in Drupal. So we're going to install that module using Composer. It'll be ignored. But let's start with, and within the examples module, there's I don't even know, 24 at least submodules in there. We're going to start with the page example module.
Okay.
Because where I like to start when I teach module development is the closest thing we can get to a hello world, right? How do I code something that puts hello world on a Drupal page? Without creating a node or whatever.
Okay, so I'm assuming it's going to create some sort of a route. Yep, there it is, right in the link.
So this is basically, routes and controllers.
Okay.
Right. And routes for me are kind of a really good entry point to learning, Drupal module development, because a route is what links the URL or the path part of the URL with PHP code. So that's kind of like the entry point for folks.
That is definitely one of the bigger changes from Drupal 7 is the Symfony way of doing things.
We got rid of the overused hook menu, we'll say.
Yeah.
Hook menu was a bit of a beast. And we jettisoned that and all of its bespoke code and fully embraced Symfony routes. So, and all the benefits thereof. So go through, and it's not a huge module, which is nice. But the way I would recommend going through it is open up the routes.yaml file first.
Okay.
And I believe there's 3 routes in there. And therefore there's 3 paths. And then there's 3 controllers, one for each of those. And then just kind of follow the breadcrumbs. Right. And you'll see, that module's got it takes arguments as part of the path as well. There's an example there. So this will give you a nice, gentle introduction to this topic, I think. It's not a ton of code, but a lot of what we see in Drupal, and this is pre-Symfony and post-Symfony, is you've got to kind of put the pieces together from file to file. So this one's a rather simple one. You're going to put the pieces together from the routing file to the controller. And there's not a whole lot more in there, but it will expose you to the directory structure, which is, PSR4 compliant. So, all of the classes are going to be in the module's SRC directory, and any forms are going to be in SRC/forms. Any controllers are going to be in SRC/controllers, and that's consistent. That's consistent through any module you look at in Drupal. If you're looking for one of its forms, you know where to look already. You go to that module, you go to SRC/forms, and there's its form. So that's one of the big advantages of modern Drupal is things are in much more predictable places.
Yeah, I remember trying to predict things like template file names, things like that. You kind of had to use helpers just to even figure that part out.
Yeah, I mean, template file names are better, but there's still challenges with that, but they're definitely better. That's for sure. So I would say, go through this stuff. And, for me, when I'm using the examples module with students, I just tell them to edit the examples module on their local. I mean, you can spin up a new mod. You can use Drush generate to do a new kind of empty module for yourself. But I would say if you want to challenge yourself, and for this, it won't be that much of a challenge, create a new route and a new controller, wire it all up, see if it works.
Well, I remember when I first learned Drupal way back in the day, and a lot of the practices carried all the way up to Drupal 7. Then a lot of things changed. It was .info file, .module file, and sometimes a .install file, and then everything else that you would load from there. So it sounds like there's a lot more structure to these things, but they're standard. So increasingly consistent.
Yep. No, there's a lot more structure. We still have a .module file, but that's mainly just hooks these days.
So there still are hooks.
Yeah, we still have hooks. Yep. I can't remember the last time I put like a custom function in a .module file. It's been a long time. And that's kind of, we'll talk about at some point like plugins. Mm-hmm. Plugins are where I think modern Drupal really shines, because back in the day, Drupal 7 days, if you wanted to write something like like a field widget, you would have to implement, and I don't know if this is accurate, 3, 4, 5 hooks, something like that. More than one, we'll say. But now if you want to implement a field widget, it's one class. And granted, there's an interface for that class, so there's certain methods, but it's all self-contained in one file in a predictable place in that SRC directory. So it is. There's a lot more structure and organization in modern Drupal than there was in the Wild West of Drupal 7 and before.
Well, the good thing is, while we're doing this, I'm still pushing through Adam Bergstein's book. So yes. I'm actually getting through some of the homework that you're doing, which is coinciding perfectly to some of the chapters that he's going through. So not too far.
As a final thought for this stuff, once you feel some level of comfort with what you see in the page example module, crack open some core modules and look at their routing file and look at their controllers. And, their routing file, 80% of what you see in a core routing file is stuff that I guarantee you is already in the page example. There'll be some other higher level concepts that are in core that aren't in the page example module. But this is, for me, teaching someone to learn Drupal is all about getting them confidence in what they're doing. So if you can crack open Drupal core and see like a routing file and open that and say, oh, I understand 75% of this stuff after 2 hours of playing with the page example module, that's going to lead to confidence. Right? So just that's kind of a big pattern with me, is we're going to learn something that appears to be easy or straightforward, or maybe not easy, but in a kind of a controlled environment. But then you can go look at well-used custom contributed modules or core and kind of see those same patterns and you start building up these layers of confidence as you learn more and more. So that's your final task for the week.
That makes sense. And that's pretty much what I did back in the day to learn Drupal too, between that and the API docs. So
yeah, Drupal core is a great it's a great place to see the way things should be done. So, all right, any questions?
No, I think that's straightforward. I think, again, these are those good baby steps, kind of keeping it on the rails, not overwhelming. I feel like every week is achievable. So this week feels achievable.
All right, go forth and learn Drupal.
Thanks a lot, as always, Mike. This is a pleasure.
See you next week.
I'm not surprised that I learned a ton from the conversation today. For some reason, I find it reassuring that Chad had some of the same issues I've had in the past with port issues in a local environment. Reminds me that we have the same struggles as developers. And of course, Mike, with so much experience, had some suggestions. And we'll see what happens with Chad next week as he goes through the process again. Mike recommended using version control, using get, and speaks to the importance of get ignore files in the project, especially around composer best practices, which is something different from Drupal 7 to Drupal 10. He talks about what to ignore within the project itself, what to ignore globally, and then also what IDE settings to ignore or keep when working with a team. And the examples module, I totally forgot about that. It's really a great way to deconstruct and almost reverse engineer the different components of Drupal, drilling in how a module works. And the best part of watching these episodes and getting into it is the weekly iteration on all the tasks. It's been absolutely fantastic. It really makes the learning curve from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 manageable and, dare I say, smooth. And as always, I'm looking forward to next week and finding out how Chad does with the homework, especially around the page example module where he's going to be learning routes and controllers. And always, Skills Upgrade is supported by Talking Drupal and Drupal Easy. You can visit talkingdrupal.com for this episode's show notes and resources. You can also visit drupaleasy.com and register for an upcoming intensive Drupal training course. To learn more about our developer or to contact Chad Hester, you can find information on his website, chadkhester.com. And Mike Anello's contact information is on drupaleasy.com/contact-us. And he is Ultimike across Mastodon, LinkedIn, X, and all the Drupal Easy stuff. You can find me as Volkswagen Chick on Mastodon and LinkedIn. And as an employee of the Linux Foundation, I want y'all to know that we're offering a 30% discount off e-learning courses, certifications, and bundles with the code, all uppercase, Drupal24, and that is good through June 5th. Really looking forward to seeing what next week brings us.